A few weeks ago, I finished up this painting, and in this week's video, I'm going to show you how to paint it. I'll show you how to approach a more complicated painting like this, and I'll go through all the techniques that I used to complete it. Not only are we going to be painting the full portrait with all of its features and textures, but we'll also be placing this woman into a scene with different points of focus. Some areas of this painting are going to be very sharp and in focus, like her face and skin textures. And then some areas, like this part of the background, are going to be very blurry and out of focus. I wanted this painting to kind of mimic the effect that you get through a camera lens, so it has almost like a cinematic look to it. And here's a photo of the completed painting, so if you're going to be painting along with me, please feel free to take a screenshot and use this as your reference. And here's a close-up of the portrait itself without any of the background. This is the part of the painting that we'll be working on within this video. So when starting out, I drew out my initial drawing, all the contour lines, using a 1x1 grid and a 4H pencil. I like a lighter pencil like this, like a 2H or a 4H. That way the lines are going to be very soft and they'll just kind of blend in when you paint over the top. And then before I start the actual painting itself, one thing that I always like to do is just go over my lines with the kneaded eraser. Kneaded erasers come in these small squares or rectangles, and then when you take it out, it's like a piece of Play-Doh or a piece of silly putty. These erasers are not aggressive at all, and what I like to do is just lightly go over my lines with it. It's going to soften them, but I can still see them. And then once I start painting and then erasing into that paint for texture, these lines are just going to disappear into the background. Like always, I'm going to start this portrait by painting in the left eye. I'll start from the center of it, from the iris and the pupil, and then work my way out. There's no particular reason for starting with the eyes. That's just where I'm most comfortable. You could start this painting wherever you'd like. I'm using a circle template here to use as a shield, and I'm lining this up with my initial drawing of the iris. The color in my airbrush is sepia, and I'm just spraying along the edge. I'll put up my completed painting on the left side of the screen here so that you can see where we're going with this. With this color sepia, I want to work my way around the iris using a few different types of shields. I'll use a circle template for the iris itself for the left and the right side, and then for the upper eyelid where it's just blocking off some of the iris, I'll use a shield that fits the curve close enough and then spray below it. And then I'll go back over to the circle template looking for a size small enough for the pupil. When I'm using any sort of shield or template, they're never going to fit the drawing perfectly. I'm not looking for perfection, I'm just looking for something close. And once those edges are in, I'll just spray in the rest freehand, constantly looking at my reference to help guide me. When painting with an airbrush, you're always going to get some overspray in some areas you don't want. So I'll use my eraser here to clean up the upper and lower eyelid, just to erase off some of that overspray. One tool that I absolutely love to use in all my airbrush paintings is an electric eraser. When I put a brand new eraser in it, I like to run it over the edge of a piece of sandpaper. This sandpaper is used for sharpening pencils, but it works really well to sharpen your eraser. And then once I have a sharp point on it, I could use a small shield to line up along the curve within the specular highlight. All the specular highlight is a highlight directly reflecting the light source. And because the eyes are wet, they're going to reflect light almost like a piece of metal or a mirror. And the shield like this helps give me a lot of control with that eraser. It's going to erase out a very sharp line. Because an electric eraser is erasing at a pretty high RPM, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to control. So if you want a sharp line or a curve, a ruler or a shield can be very helpful. For the whites of the eyes or the sclera, I'm using the color black here, which I over-reduced with some distilled water. This color black is a transparent color, but I'm making it more transparent by adding that water to it. And because this color is over-reduced, I'm dropping my PSI down to around 15 so that this paint doesn't spider web out and I get a lot more control. Throughout this entire painting, I'm spraying at 20 PSI, but for this area, I need to drop it down just because the paint is so thin. When I'm looking at the reference, I'm trying to notice where I see the darkest areas within the sclera. It's definitely darkest at the extreme corner of the left and the right side of the eye, but it's also a little bit darker on the top and bottom. And because this is a transparent color, if I want those areas darker, I just spray more. The eyelashes are being reflected within that specular highlight, so I'll use my eraser here and erase right into this black paint, leaving out a few gaps to make it look like those are the eyelashes. I'll also use this black paint to spray in just above the eye itself where the upper eyelid is. This is because the eyelashes are just kind of clumped together there, forming a pretty dark mass of value. And to define the reflection a bit more in the eye, I'll use a black colored pencil to draw on the eyelashes. So let's move along to some of the skin tones, and the color mixture for this is at the bottom of the screen. I'm using a shield and spraying below it for this crease just above the upper eyelid. That'll give me a sharp line at the top of this curve and a softer one at the bottom. And of course, this flesh tone mixture is a transparent color. So what I'm going to start doing is spraying it over this upper eyelid. Because it's transparent, if any of the overspray from this gets into the eye or the iris, pupil, it's not really going to affect anything because those areas are darker anyway. And with this color, I'm just going to continue spraying it above the eye, focusing on the curves and the gradations. And you can see what that does. On this upper eyelid, I sprayed some more paint on the top and the bottom of it. So those areas just look like they're a little bit farther away. And in the center here, I sprayed less paint, and I'm using my eraser now to pull out some more of the paint, making it lighter. This area is going to look like it's catching some light, making it look like it's closer to us. And that combination of light and dark and the gradient between them gives off the illusion of a 3D object on this 2D surface, on this canvas. We have a long way to go with this one, but already that illusion of a 3D object of this eye itself is starting to come together. A few months ago, we painted a skull on this channel, and it was actually for a Halloween video. But in that one, I talked about the importance of painting skulls or drawing from them, and just kind of understand the basic anatomy of the skull itself, because it is the structure underneath every portrait like the one we're working on now. And we can clearly see that with this eye and the surrounding area right now. If you remember, the hole where the eye is in the skull is called the orbit. And just above it, where the eyebrow is, the start of the forehead, it's called the frontal bone. And because the light source here is slightly above the subject, that frontal bone is casting a shadow into the orbit. So what that means is everything within this eye is going to be in a very subtle cast shadow. Everything here is going to be a little bit darker than normal. So I sprayed in the darker area where the frontal bone is, and then off to the right where the nasal bone is. And then inside here within the orbit, I'm going to have to keep building up this paint, spraying more of it to get it darker and darker. I'm just going to be starting out with this flesh tone at first, but later on I'll be using pure sepia right out of the bottle, and then after that I'll be using a little bit of pure black just to glaze over the top of everything to darken it up. To bring out some of those highlights where the light is catching the lower part of the frontal bone, I'm using my eraser and erasing out in small circular motions, making sure that they overlap. If I overlap them like this, I could pull out a large area of highlight rather than just a bunch of small scratches. Now for the eyebrow itself, a lot of it is in shadow, so we're not going to be seeing too much detail within it. So before I start darkening it up, I'm using a black colored pencil here and just sketching in a bunch of thin lines following the shape and the curve of the eyebrow itself. So even though I'll be darkening this up later by spraying paint over the top of it, it will still look like there's some hair within it. And for the eyelashes, the easiest way for me to add these in is to use that black colored pencil again. As I sketch these out, I'm trying to make them wider at the base where they start to grow out from that upper eyelid. And then as they move up to the top, they just get thinner to a narrow, sharp point. I'm switching over to the color black here, diluted about 10% with distilled water, and I'm spraying it on the left side of this eye to get that shadow in. Then I'll switch over to the color sepia and start spraying it right over this flesh tone in some of the areas that I want to be darker. In order for parts of this eye to look like it's in shadow, we need to darken these areas up. So the sepia and the black paint will help us get there, but it'll also cool down the values, make it less red, less orange. For this area underneath the eye and the lower eyelid, I'm going back to that flesh tone mixture, which is a transparent color, and I'll be using some shields just to get in a few of the sharper lines. Most of this though is going to be done freehand. When I'm working on a painting like this that has a lot of things going on in it, I'm always trying to simplify everything. What I mean by that is that I'll focus on one part of the painting like what I'm doing here. I'm only painting in the eye and the surrounding skin tone. And then I'll paint that the best I can, as close as I can get it to what it's going to look like in the final painting. And then I'll use this part of the painting, this eye, as kind of like the springboard or the jumping off place for the rest of the painting. Everything is going to be built around this. I like to think of any painting as a summation or a combination of a bunch of small paintings that come together. And the way that I build up these small paintings is that I start with one, like the eye right here, and then use that to paint the area next to it, which is going to be the flesh tone below it. Once that's done, I can go lower, paint the lips, or I can move over to the right and paint the nose. So I almost think of it like a path. I start at one point, and then I use that to paint the area next to it, and I just keep building up around that. And when I do it this way, it simplifies it because I'm only thinking about the part that I'm painting. Everything else in the painting is not even entering my mind. And I'm not suggesting that this technique will work for everybody, but if you find yourself getting overwhelmed or starting to rush. Instead of jumping around to different parts of the painting, just pick one point, start from there, and build up around it. Working my way down to the cheek, I'm going back to the flesh tone mixture, and where the zygomatic bone is, right underneath the orbit, I'm spraying some darker paint toward the bottom and to the left of it. If you look at the completed painting, you'll notice that the left side of the face is pretty dark, so we're going to need to add a good amount of paint in there. I'll use some sepia later on to spray over the top of it, but for now, I'm just sticking with the flesh tone mixture. Now for my style of painting, what I'm doing here is one of the most important parts of this technique, and that's erasing, because I'm using Createx illustration colors here, which are an erasable paint. I'm also painting on a smooth canvas, so it makes it very easy to kind of scratch off and remove this paint. So the way that I do this is I erase out in small circular motions, letting these overlap each other. I'm not using much pressure at all. I'm just lightly pressing it to the canvas and erasing out in small circles, just making sure that they overlap. And the reason that's important is because I'm not pulling out individual points of highlights here. I'm pulling out a larger value of highlight underneath this eye, so it makes it look like this part is kind of sticking up or is closer to us as the viewer. And as I'm erasing like this, I'll make some more passes over the center, use a little bit more pressure in there to pull out more paint to make that part brighter. And then as I move into the shadows, into the darker area, I continue with the circle motion, but I use less pressure. And I'll use this erasing technique across the entire portrait. Here's a shot of it on a camera slider so you can see it up close. And up close, you can clearly see that there's a fair amount of texture in this, but I like that look because when the viewer sees the entire painting, this part of the portrait just has something a little bit different than the backgrounds and the surrounding area. And this erasing technique is slow, there's no question about it, but what I love about it is you get so much control. Because when you spray paint with an airbrush over a larger area, sometimes you spray a bit too much. And a small area of darker paint is going to look like a shadow in the portrait, making that part of it look slightly off or wrong. It's important to remember that shadows and highlights define all the shapes in a portrait. So if there's something that looks like a shadow where there's not supposed to be one, that part of the painting is going to look a little weird. And so with the eraser, I can come into any area, just like what I did here, and just lighten it up by erasing out small circles, just going over an area that's too dark, and it's going to bring the value down a little bit. And I'll be using this erasing technique across all of the flesh tones. From here, I'll just work my way down, and I'll start by painting in the nose. I'm still using the flesh tone mixture, and I'll start with the shield here. Line this up with the left side of the nose. This is called the ala of the nose, and then spray to the left where there's a small cast shadow. I'll also use a shield to define the top sharp edge of the nostril. Those two edges seemed like the most important parts of the nose to get in first, so once I get those in, I could start spraying the rest of it in freehand. Because this is a transparent paint, those lines are not going to go anywhere, they'll just get a bit darker. And now with this airbrush, I could start spraying in the shadows. This is going to define the entire shape of the nose. Noses are actually pretty simple to paint and pretty forgiving. But even though I must have painted 1,000 noses in my life, I'm still looking at the reference because every single nose is going to be slightly different. I'm trying to pay attention to where I see darker areas and where I see lighter areas. I always like to squint my eyes when I look at the reference just to see those large areas of light and dark. And if I get those major values in place, the nose basically paints itself. Over to the right nostril here, it's hard to see that much detail because of the foreshortening, but I noticed just a very small amount of that right nostril was showing through there, so I used a shield to paint that in, and then I also used that same shield to define the right side of the nose itself. This way we get the nose, which is going to be slightly lighter than the darker cheek value to the right of it. And of course this video is sped up so I can get through this information quickly, but so far with the nose I probably spent around 15 to 20 minutes on it, which is not that long at all, and it's already starting to come together. It's starting to look like a nose. And then once that paint's down, it's time to switch over to the eraser, just like what I talked about before, and erase out in small circular motions. While I'm erasing out these highlights, I could see a very light trace, almost like a hint of my drawing underneath, so that's guiding me. I know exactly where these highlights are going to be because I marked them off in my initial drawing with a grid. So while I'm looking at my reference and adding highlights and shadows in, I just have a bit more confidence knowing that I'm putting them in the right place. Once the nose is complete, I'm going to compare it to the area that I just painted before, so the cheek and that left eye. So I'm looking at these two areas and comparing it to the reference and then just making adjustments as I need them. One of the ways that I think about painting, and it's also a good way to be a bit easier on yourself, is that I think of it like a series of mistakes. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm never able to get a painting to look as good as I want it to. Throughout every single painting I work on, I make countless mistakes. And a huge part of painting, a very important part in my opinion, is to use your observation and see if you could notice those mistakes. See if you could find the areas that aren't as good as they can be. And as I'm working on any new part of a painting, I'm always going back to the areas that I worked on before to see if I could just improve on them a little bit. Not to try to fix them, to make them look perfect or make them look like a photograph, but see if I can make that area look a little bit better than it was before. And that's one of the reasons that I always say it's so important to take your time in painting, not to rush, and of course to take breaks, walk away from the painting, do something else for a while, because when you come back to it, you're going to see it with fresh eyes and you're going to see it differently. So going back to the painting, what I'm doing now is I'm just spraying in some paint to try to define the left side of the face where the cheek is going down to the jaw. I used a large shield to spray in that jawline, and I just sprayed below it where the neck is going to be, which is going to be pretty dark later on. Now you'll notice at this point of the painting, the one that I'm working on the right side of the screen, the values on the face look very, very dark. The reason that these look so dark right now and might look a bit wrong is just because everything surrounding it is pure white. It's important to remember that surrounding values and colors are always going to affect the way that you see your painting. So if the background is pure white like it is here, everything is going to look a little bit darker. This is why in traditional painting, like oil painting, a lot of artists like to tint their canvas before they start painting a portrait. When using transparent colors in an airbrush where you're erasing into the paint, you don't really have that option. But the good news is you get used to it. You get used to understanding that your values are going to look a little bit differently until the surrounding area is painted in. And this is also one of the reasons why I always recommend to paint on the lighter side until you get the background painted in, because it's a lot easier to darken values than it is to lighten them. And of course, I'm talking about this in respect to using transparent paints like what I use in my paintings. And what I'm doing here is just like what I talked about a minute ago. I'm going back to areas with my eraser and just reworking them, seeing if I can make them a little bit better. Now that the nose, the eye, and the left cheek are all painted in, let's move on to the mouth. The first thing I want to do is get in that transition point between the upper and lower lip. Normally, I would just use a freehand shield for this, but this one had a few curves in it that were a little bit difficult to do, kind of like wavy up and down. So I decided to go with the Frisket film. After placing this on, I just cut out a curve following that transition between the upper and lower lip, and then I sprayed some paint below it. I'm holding the airbrush pretty close to the surface here so that I can lay on that paint exactly where I want it. I want to make sure that paint and overspray does not get past the corners of the lips. The color in my airbrush right now is the flesh tone with a fair amount of scarlet, which is red, added to it. I'm using a ripped piece of paper as a shield here for that upper lip, and I want to lightly spray this on just so I can get that defining edge between the upper lip and the skin texture above it. And now if you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you'll notice that there's not too much going on with this upper lip because it's basically fully in shadow. And when something's in a darker shadow, like a cast shadow, you're not going to see that much detail or texture in it. The reason that we see textures in painting is because light is hitting it. All texture really is a combination of a lot of very small highlights and shadows next to each other. And in order to see highlights and shadows, light needs to be hitting it. So this upper lip is in a pretty darker cast shadow, so we're not going to see that texture. I just worked my way along the outside of the upper lip just to help soften up that transition point where it's going to switch over to the skin texture. And from here, I switched over from the lip color back to the flesh tone mixture, and I'm spraying in some of the skin tones between the upper lip and the nose. This darker area right in the center where it's a bit concave is called the philtrum, and generally there will be a shadow in there. That's what we see here, right below the columella of the nose. We have a darker shadow within the philtrum. So as I get those basic values in, I'm also going to take this flesh tone and start spraying it over the lip. This is going to help darken it and reduce some of that red from that initial mixture. Now, a lot of this area right underneath the nose where the philtrum is pretty dark, so we're going to have to slowly work our way up to this, just like everything else in the painting. But for now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'm just sticking with the flesh tone mixture. If I want to darken it up later, I can always use some pure sepia or some pure black. The area just above the upper lip, below the philtrum, which sometimes people call the Cupid's bow, is slightly raised, so it's going to be catching some light. So in order to make it look like that, I'm going to start erasing into it, pulling out some paint. And while I'm doing this, I'm kind of blending the skin texture into the lip texture. And while I'm erasing, it's just like what I talked about before. I'm erasing in small circular motions. I'll be doing this throughout the entire painting. For the lower lip, I decided to start it by painting in the surrounding area, meaning the chin and those surrounding skin values. There's this pretty dark cast shadow below this lower lip, so painting that in first with the shield will define that shape of the lip. And to paint in the chin itself, I'm going to use that same technique by painting in the surrounding area, the area behind it, to help define it. I'm using a shield here to line up with the edge of the chin and the background where the hair is going to be, and then I just sprayed below it to give that dark outline, that transition point between the chin and the background. So now that that background is in, it sets the shape of the chin. So from here, I can switch over to the airbrush freehand and start spraying in the values that I see on this chin. I notice that it's definitely darker in shadow on the left side and at the bottom, and then it gets a bit brighter here in the center where the light's hitting it. So in that area, I just want to spray less paint. So you can see that this part of the chin is very similar to the way that I painted in the nose. I just used a shield to define a few of the outline areas, and then the rest was painted in freehand to get in the basic shapes. And the way that you get shapes or planes in any painting is just about where you place those values and how dark and how light they are. The values are always going to define everything within the painting. In order to paint this lower lip, I'm switching over from the flesh tone mixture to the lip color mixture. And I'll be spraying most of this in freehand because we already have those defining points, those sharp points of the upper lip, and then that skin texture with that cast shadow underneath. And because this lip color is a transparent color, I could spray it right over the top. Overspray is not really going to affect much here. And as I'm spraying these in, I'm just thinking about what areas are dark and light. It's obvious that the darkest part of this lower lip is toward the top of it, and then also again at the bottom. Light is hitting the center of it, so that part is going to be the brightest, so I spray less paint there. From here, what I'd like to do is start adding in some of these creases and folds within the lip. I'll use a ripped piece of paper for this because it has that textured edge, and then I'll just start in the center and add in a few lines going up vertically. When using a shield to spray in some small lines like this, it's very important not to spray too much. You don't want these getting too dark. And what these lines are going to be is they're going to act as the shadows for the highlights within these creases. And in order to add those highlights, I'm going to go right back over to the stick eraser. Now you can clearly see here in my painting that some of my initial pencil lines are showing through that transparent paint. And I love that about transparent paint because it's going to make it easier for me. Those lines are kind of like a small cheat sheet for me. I see where my highlights and shadows need to go from my initial drawing. Once I start erasing into the paint or spraying some darker paint over it, those lines will start to disappear. But for now, in the earlier stages where I'm keeping everything light, I can still see them, so it's very helpful. So as I'm looking at my reference, I'm just going to add these highlights in vertically, just scratching out up and down, trying to follow the shapes that I see from that reference. The major mass of light is hitting the center, the middle part of the lip, so that part I'm going to pull out the most paint, and then as I move along to the sides, I just use less pressure with that eraser. Once those areas are erased out, I'll go back over to the airbrush with that lip color and glaze some of it over the top just to knock them down a bit. I'll switch over to some pure black paint here to spray in that transition, that dark shadow between the upper lip and the lower lip. I lined up my shields with the upper lip and then lightly sprayed this black paint below it. Just a small amount of black paint will go a long way. So I'll switch back over now to that flesh tone mixture and start spraying this over the lips and around the area in that skin texture to start darkening everything up. And then it's right back over to the eraser, starting on the chin and working my way out. I'll erase out just like what I talked about before, using a lot of small circular motions, making sure they overlap to pull out large values, large masses of highlight rather than individual ones. This erasing part is definitely slow, but again, you're just going to get so much control. You could shift any of the values, make them slightly lighter just by taking your time with that eraser. And you'll see during this sped up part, it's just that of using the eraser and using the airbrush in combination, lightening areas and darkening areas, just trying to make everything a little bit better than it was before. Now for the right eye, I'm going to speed through this because it's the exact same thing as the left eye, and I'm sure you're getting sick of me talking this whole time, but I will go over it very quickly, kind of like a recap. I started with the sepia and used some shields to spray in the iris and the pupil. I used the color black, which was over-reduced, to spray in the sclera of the eyes, and then right back over to the transparent flesh tone to start spraying in the area above the eye. The eyelashes and the upper eyelid are added in using a black colored pencil sharpened to a very fine point. And once those hairs are added into the eyebrow, I just glaze a thin layer of the transparent flesh tone right over the top of it. Once I get in that area painted in just above the eye, I'll start working on the lower eyelid and then moving my way down to that lower cheek. And this part is exactly the same as the left eye. I used a few shields to define some of the sharper lines, but most of this area here is done freehand with a lot of erasing. If you notice some areas within the eye or around it that have some very bright specular highlights, you could use an electric eraser like you'll see me using here. Just use it sparingly though, and when you do that, you're just going to pull out a very small bright highlight. Now before I go any farther, I want to define the edge of the face. The color in my airbrush here is a mixture of black and Payne's gray, and I'm using a large shield to line up with different parts of the right side of the painting. Basically starting at the chin, moving up the jaw, up to the cheek. As I line up my shield, I'm spraying a small amount of paint over to the right side. This is where the hair is going to be, and a lot of this is in a dark shadow. And it's important to understand here that this area is a transition point. It's the start of that shadow within the hair. I know at this point right now, it almost looks like an outline, but that's not what it's going to be. I'm going to extend this farther out. Like I talked about in some other tutorials, an outline, like a dark line surrounding any part of a painting, is going to flatten it and it's going to make it look like a cartoon. So instead of thinking of outlines, I just like to think of transition points where one value shifts from one to another. So right here, we're setting up the transition point between the flesh tone and those textures and then the darker hair color. And then once that edge is painted in, I could switch back over to the flesh tone, spray it into this area along the right side of the cheek, and then come right back in with the eraser to pull out those highlights and adjust the values. And that's pretty much it for the portrait itself. The only thing we're really missing here is the forehead, but the forehead itself is actually pretty simple. It's basically a flat value with some small highlights in the center. So what I did for this is I switched back over to the flesh tone, and then you can see I just sprayed a bit more of this along the outside parts. I sprayed some more of this flesh tone color toward the bottom of the forehead where the eyebrows are, and then I also sprayed some more along the top left and the top right where the skull just kind of rounds over back where the hair is going to be. And those darker values along the perimeter of the forehead is just going to help give that 3D rounded look. It'll make it look like those areas are just kind of rolling away from us. And at this point, everything is in place within the portrait itself. So what I do here is I come in with the eraser and start working the whole portrait. I'll start here on the forehead and work my way around. I want to make sure that I'm taking breaks during this and just kind of stepping away from the painting, trying to see it again with fresh eyes. And a lot of times when you do this, you're going to notice some areas within the paint that's just a bit too dark, so you can clean it up with the eraser. This is actually one of my favorite parts of the painting, just working every part of it with the eraser, trying to pull everything together. And like I said before, I like to think of painting as a summation of a bunch of small paintings that come together. And that's what this final step is about. It's just focusing on the portrait itself, those main features of the eyes, the nose, the mouth, and all the surrounding skin texture, and then just using that eraser to add textures and add even values across the entire portrait. And even though working with the eraser is slow, I love the control, and it's just one of my favorite parts of painting. I feel like I could do this hours on end and never get bored of it. It's important to take breaks, make sure you stop while you're still painting well. So that way, when you come back to it, you have enthusiasm and you have some confidence to continue forward. So that's it for the first part of this one. We painted in the entire portrait itself. And in the next part of this video, I'll show you how I painted the background. We'll start with the hair, which on the left side is sharp and on the right gets a little bit softer. And then of course, I'll show you how to paint that really blurry, out of focus look of the trees, the forest on the right side, and then that tree trunk on the left. I'll also be continuing the neck, the shoulders, all of that skin tone on the members page. And of course, I want to thank the members for their very generous support. They were very helpful during this last year, so I can't thank you guys enough. I'd like to welcome the 3 newest members this week, Sebastian, Manny, and Thomas at a generous tier 3. Thank you guys so much and welcome. And finally, to finish up this video, I just want to personally thank all of the channel members by reading off their names. I want to start with the guys who are legends to me, the guys who've been supporting this channel from the very beginning. That's Andrew, Dwayne, M. Shibley, Ken, Pete, Carl, Mackie Mark, Mere Creative, M. Webb, John, Adam, Robin, Peter, Rick, NH, William, Hector, Airbrush Art and Customs, Fernando, Svavar, Michael. All of these people have been supporting the channel for about a year, some close to 2 years, which is just so crazy to me and just So beyond generous of you. So thank you all so much. And of course, I want to thank the support of the current channel members, starting with the longest. So thank you to Joshua, Adrian, Israel, Tony, Thomas, Phil, Mark W., Grant P., Thaga, Tony H., Mike C., PSI Burr, Ari, John, Pascal, Serge, Christine, Ryland, Sandra, Marvin, Crossroads, Robert, Kevin, Altmac, Dieter, Jeff, Steve, Alex, Jonathan, and the newest members, Johnny B., Jason, Thomas, Sebastian, and Manny. Your support means more to me than you might think, so thank you all so much. And because this video is being posted a few days before Christmas, I want to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. And if you celebrate something different, I wish you happy holidays and a very happy New Year. Thank you again, everyone. I hope you're all well. Have a great week. I'll see you back here next Friday.